riots in France and continued resistance in the U.S. Plus, did Brett Kavanaugh betray pro-lifers? You're listening to Constructive Interference. Hello and welcome back to Constructive Interference. I am your host, Joel Kurtnitis, here as always with my partner in crime, Josh Hugo. If you haven't followed us on social media yet, you need to get out there and make sure you do that. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/TheCI Show and on Twitter at TheCI Show, conveniently enough. We're also on Google Play and iTunes, so if you haven't had a chance to get out and give us a follow yet, make sure you follow us so you don't miss an episode. We've got some cool stuff to cover tonight. We're going to be talking about the riots in France and just in general, like what is the line for protesting? And it seems like there's, in the last few years, there's just been this huge uptick in protests and everything is a movement now. And so we're going to talk about that. But first, I wanted to look at a little bit of I guess I would call it a tempest in the teapot about a little known decision by the Supreme Court. So there was not an actual decision on the Supreme Court other than that they refused to take a case or hear a case that was passed up from the federal circuit courts on a case that involved Planned Parenthood, basically. So Planned Parenthood, America's largest abortion provider, after they endured a scandal a couple years ago about selling fetal tissues and body parts, which is gruesome and horrifying on its own merit, several states tried to block them from getting Medicaid funding. Without getting into too much of the weeds, they sued those states to get their funding restored. Well, different states have done it and different circuit courts have ruled differently on it. We currently have, as I understood it, we had 5 circuit courts that decided that the states did not have the right to block their funding and 1 circuit court that decided that they did. So they passed it up to the Supreme Court, and our new Supreme Court with a conservative majority, quote, conservative majority, did not take the case. They chose to punt on it, basically. A lot of conservative folks and a lot of conservative pundits, I would say, immediately started raising the alarm. The Supreme Court has betrayed pro-lifers. Kavanaugh's a fraud. And that's what was noteworthy about it, right? Is it takes at least 4 justices have to agree to hear a case in order for it to come before the Supreme Court. They failed to reach that mark because Roberts and Kavanaugh, obviously 2 Republican appointed justices, sided with the liberals and stopped the case from moving forward. I guess first of all, Josh, had you heard about this at all?
Well, I've seen the headlines declaring that Kavanaugh is a traitor and how, we got this guy on the Supreme Court for no reason because look how wishy-washy he is. I saw those headlines. As far as hearing an explanation like you gave, not as much. So it sounds like what you're saying now, we're talking about Medicaid money, correct?
Well, yeah. And that's so that's where, that's why I think anything that says anymore, we're just such a knee-jerk society. There's such a knee-jerk reaction to anything. And look, I am as pro-life as they come. Okay, I am passionate about that issue. I think it's the biggest tragedy in America right now, the biggest civil rights issue in America right now. But not everything that has Planned Parenthood in the title is an opportunity to overturn Roe. Okay, it's just not. It's not in the cards. And that's why I think it gets frustrating to me when I see these knee-jerk reactions of people who are just looking to be validated on something they already thought. And in this case, it would be, the people who were opposed to Kavanaugh or opposed to Kavanaugh for Trump's sake, who are just waiting to be disappointed. They're just like that, like the old quote from Angels in the Outfield. You can't go through life thinking that everybody you meet will one day let you down. It's kind of sad that I remember that word for word, but I do. So this was the controversy that came up, and I've seen a lot of this knee-jerk reaction. And I'm not going to say that it's not important, okay? Whether we're funding any organization, especially one that's potentially morally abominable to half of America, with tax money, that's a big question, okay? It is a big question. But saying that refusing to take this case is a betrayal of the pro-life cause, I don't see it. And frankly, having read the dissent on this, I don't think that the dissenters, the dissenting portion of the court that were conservatives, saw it either.
Well, make sure I understand this correctly. Now, we're talking about Medicaid money, which is federal money, right?
Well, Medicaid is state money. Medicare is federal money. So Medicaid is the state portion of that, and that's where the states were actually passing laws to bar Medicaid money from going to Planned Parenthood, and not just Planned Parenthood. As I understand it, there were other people involved in the suit too, but it was primarily Planned Parenthood. So in the dissent, Justice Clarence Thomas, that wishy-washy moderate Justice Clarence Thomas, had an interesting statement about it, and a lot of people kind of latched onto the first part of the statement without reading through the rest of it. So what he said is, so what explains the court's quote, what explains the court's refusal to do its job here? I suspect it has something to do with the fact that some respondents in these cases are named Planned Parenthood. That makes the court's decision particularly troubling as the question presented has nothing to do with abortion. Now, a lot of people took that first part about, oh, they're scared to do anything about it because of the name Planned Parenthood, and stopped reading right there. And then they took that and drew up a bunch of, inflammatory headlines. See, Clarence Thomas says they're all scared of Planned Parenthood. Okay, but that's not what he said. He said it's troubling that they don't want to take this case, and he thinks they're worried about Planned Parenthood, which is more troubling because this case has nothing to do with abortion. That's what he went on to say. He said, it's true that these particular, and again, quote, it is true that these particular cases arose after several states alleged that Planned Parenthood affiliates had, among other things, engaged in the illegal sale of fetal organs and fraudulent billing practices, and thus removed Planned Parenthood as a state Medicaid provider. However, these cases are not about abortion rights. They are about private rights of action under the Medicaid Act. Resolving the question here would not even affect Planned Parenthood's ability to challenge the state's decisions, end quote. So I think, if the dissenting justices themselves are looking at this and saying, hey, we wanted to take the case, we think it is an important case, but not because it's going to end abortion, then I think it's not really wise, in my opinion, for people to, go to war over this and declare Kavanaugh and others traitors. It doesn't make sense in this case. Now, I'm still skeptical. Kavanaugh still has to prove himself to me. I'm glad that he got in because of the controversy that he endured that we discussed in an earlier episode, but I'm still skeptical about him. It's just that this is not the case to judge him on. I don't think this, you really can't determine whether he's going to be sufficiently pro-life based on whether he takes a case that's really only deciding Medicare.
Right. I mean, it sounds like it's a question more of procedure, Medicare procedure, and what sorts of processes can states use to allocate funding, which, as you said, has really nothing to do with abortion specifically.
Well, right, and the other part of that is that people, I feel like, and I'm guilty of this at times too, but I think people who are involved in everyday political activism, who are used to just standing on their side of the line and throwing rocks at the other side, you don't understand the degree to which the court system, and the Supreme Court in particular, is completely bound up in process and precedent. They can't just do whatever they want. Despite attempts by them to do whatever they wanted in the past, there's just this everything has to be done in just such a way. They're bound by so many constraints that you look at these things and they can't just take a case about, they can't take a case about Medicaid and say we hereby outlaw fracking. They can't do that. There's jurisdictional questions, there's precedent questions, there's all of these things that have to be decided before you can walk into a case and just overturn things. So I felt like this today was kind of an inappropriate thing, but it did get a lot of people up in arms. And speaking of people up in arms, Josh Hugo, what's going on in France right now?
Lots of destruction, from what I can see.
The usual.
Well, no, it's not the usual, because this time it's French people doing the destruction in France. Not
harsh, yes. Buddy.
Yeah, I think it's funny. You have these the yellow vest protesters. The yellow vest, of course, being a symbol of safety. And don't accidentally hit me. But that's now become the symbol of almost replacing like the sort of the black hoodies and the face masks as being a symbol of violent protest. It's kind of ironic to me.
Well, if they hit you, it won't be an accident.
Right.
I guess it's effective in that regard.
They want to make sure you see them coming. It's like fair warning. You might get smacked if you stand in my way. Here's a yellow vest. But joking aside, though, it's like it's a very generalized protest. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but from the articles that I've looked at, we have basically a very generalized protest of discontent with the French government, sparked specifically by an increase in French fuel taxes. Now, the price of gas in France has been going up. I understand it's gone up about 25% over the last year. It's cost them over $6 a gallon already to fuel their cars.
Clearly Trump's fault.
Yes. Somehow. And so this new tax was being pushed through, supposedly to combat global warming, which would have increased the price of gas a further 25 cents a gallon. And that was a straw that broke the camel's back. And now we have people in the streets.
I can't believe that they don't appreciate these attempts to save them from imminent global collapse. Can you? I mean, how unthankful can you get?
I know, and so you'd think that as you see your money, dwindling, and you see that you don't have enough money to purchase, the necessities of your life, or you don't have any extra spending money to buy things you want, that you wouldn't just feel grateful for that and think, "Oh, I'm so glad that people in 80 years might theoretically have something better because of this."
A bunch of science deniers.
I know. But yeah, it's interesting. I had no idea this was the case, but the government in France spends a huge amount of money, controls a huge amount of the economy. Actually, spending by the French government is, let me look at this here, about 56% of their GDP, which means
56%.
56%, which means
like
that
5-6, like more than half of their total country's domestic product.
Good math there, Joel. Good math.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. So basically, in France, the majority of the dollars. The majority of the francs spent in France are spent by the French government. And I think that's a significant part of why these protests have become so widespread and so intense is because people in France don't feel like they have a lot of power to change things in other ways. When your government is taxing you to that extent, to the extent that, more than half the money being spent is spent by them, which of course comes from your taxes, I mean, you'd feel powerless. And I think
hashtag you didn't build that.
Yes. But yeah, so I mean, just so yeah, that gas tax increase has just triggered sort of the general discontent that's been bubbling there, wow. And people aren't happy.
Unreal. Well, this sounds vaguely familiar to me. I feel like there's been a pretty large incident in history where French discontentedness bubbled over into some violent protesting. So maybe it'd be good for us to talk about protests in general, how this happens, how this cycle actually recurs, and what it looks like in different situations, and what the underlying principles of it are.
That's a topic that's caused a lot of frustration for me recently, because you have protests, and you have riots, and you have civil disobedience, and then you have revolutions. And all of these things are just so recklessly conflated in everyday rhetoric that it gets really difficult to explain what you mean.
Well, sure, because in the media, everything is the most inflammative, in most inflammatory term possible, right? So if you have like somebody smack another dude, all of a sudden we call it a gigantic, fist fight brawl in the street because it attracts readers, right? Like that's right. What you do. You just take it and you make it as ridiculous as possible to get the clicks. But you're saying that's not the case.
Oh, it is sometimes. But I mean, just even of course, when I'm on social media, seeing what people are, what I'll call the common folk, the peasons on Twitter and Facebook.
Here we go.
Yeah,
let them eat cake.
But just people in general talking. It's like you have a bunch of people go out, for instance, and block a highway and shut down traffic, and those people are referred to as protesters. I'm thinking, well, no, that's not a protest. Those people are really rioting. That's not a protest. A protest is when you speak. A protest is when you go out in a public place and you have a sign or you have a megaphone or just a T-shirt and you express yourself. You express your message of discontent so that people can see it and understand what you're trying to say. And that's a protest. A protest does not involve destruction of property. A protest does not involve blocking or assaulting or even inconveniencing people going about their business. A protest is just that, a protest. And I've just seen a lot of conflation of terms that I think is really unhelpful.
So a protest, okay. So this is actually gets into a little bit of personal territory for me. A few years ago, I don't know if you knew this, during the government shutdown that was inspired by, or that was kind of pushed by Ted Cruz when Obama was president. You remember the DC monuments were all shut down? Like they shut down the...
Yes.
You remember the Lincoln Memorial and all those things? All the monuments were shut down, which was ridiculous because the idea was, well, we don't have the funding to keep them open, but it actually cost more money, it turns out, to shut them down than to keep them open in cases like that.
Because it costs a lot of money to keep a statue open.
Right. It's a big marble statue at the top of a staircase. Like you don't exactly have to maintain it every other day. So anyway, but during that whole thing, I actually organized what I would have considered a protest at the time. And all we did was just we went to these monuments and we said, look, these are our monuments. They belong to the American people, and you're not going to block them off just because you feel like making a political statement. And we had a group of a few hundred people that actually it was kind of amazing. Actually, it was very I put this thing together in the hopes that people would show up. Had no idea if anybody would, but there was just that common will to, and honestly, people just pulled the barricades out of the way, and we all went up to the monument until police chased us off. So was that a protest, or would you classify that as something else?
Well, no, that really wasn't a protest.
It started out a protest.
No. Well, yeah, but see that's another category of another category of public action, we'll say, which is civil disobedience. And civil disobedience is another term that is often conflated. I see on the news these people who go out and block highways, or just like I remember back in 2011, 2012, during the heyday of the Occupy Wall Street movement, you'd have people would go out and they'd just like form a human chain to block a sidewalk, or go on a college campus and form a chain to block a square, so people couldn't get by, couldn't get to class, whatever. And those people were referred to as practicing civil disobedience.
I'm guessing that's illegal.
Well, see, the thing is, civil disobedience is exactly what you did, Joel. It's like the government said you can't do this thing. The government said you can't go up to the big statue on top of the steps. That space is off limits. And you went up there. You disobeyed the government. You said no. You said no to the man. You said, I'm going to do what I want to do, and you won't stop me. And you disobeyed. But that's completely different, though, from these sort of arbitrary nuisances that are created when people go out and, for instance, block a highway. It's like, because they're not disobeying, they're disobeying a law, of course, by blocking it, but the law they're disobeying is not the law they're protesting. Those people blocking a highway, they're not protesting highways. They're just making themselves a nuisance. When you went up and walked up those steps to see the statue, you were protesting the law or the rule that said you couldn't go there.
Okay, so you would say that the kind of the distinguishing factor of civil disobedience then is the specificity of the application.
Oh yeah, in civil disobedience, it's like there is a particular law that you think is wrong, and so to demonstrate that the law is wrong, you go and you break it. You break it publicly, or people can see you, and if you get arrested or whatever, you take the consequence, because your point that you're trying to make is that this law is wrong. And you're proving that the law is wrong by breaking it, and that's civil disobedience.
So what's the next step up from that then?
Well, these things they kind of bleed into each other, I guess.
Sure, of course, and we'll get into the distinctions.
Yeah. So protesting, if you're protesting, you're simply saying, you're speaking your mind. You're speaking your mind in a public and a forceful way, but you're really just speaking. Civil disobedience, you are breaking the law to prove the law is wrong. I guess if you want to talk the next step up in terms of forcefulness or in terms of violence, the next step up would be rioting. And what is a riot, really? I said that people who block highways, I would classify as being rioters, because what a riot really is, it's sort of like taking a hostage. Not necessarily taking a person hostage, but you're taking a public space hostage, a street, a public square, a highway, and you're saying, this place is ours, we're going to occupy this space, obstruct this space, prevent this space from being used for its designated purpose until our demands are met. And, the intent, riots by their nature tend to be highly disorganized, but really that's what it's about. To the extent that they are organized, to the extent they do have a purpose, that's the purpose. We're gonna take the space hostage until you give us what we want.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Okay, so you got rioting, and I have some interesting examples I'm going to throw at you after this, probably. But okay, so is there a next step up from that?
Well, you hope for rioting. Generally speaking, when people do riots, they're not wanting to do violence. They're not wanting to overthrow the government. Basically, the people
right, they just want to smash a storefront and take some stuff.
Well, that's kind of that's not supposed to be the point.
They just want that plasma, dude.
That's not supposed to be the point of it.
Yeah, that's probably what they tell the cops on the way out, right? I don't want to overthrow the government, man. I want that plasma.
Yeah, well, the government says they can't have the plasma, but yeah. So yeah, the yellow vest people in France, like they're not aiming to overthrow the government. They might want the particular president, Macron. Is it how you say his name? It's a French name, so I'm probably saying it wrong. But some of them want Macron to resign, but they don't want the government destroyed in general. They just want some demands to be met. Take that a step further, and you have then rebellion. And a rebellion is different from a riot because it is organized, it has a long duration, and it intends to use deadly force. Generally people who are
All of
rioting.
which I learned from Star Wars.
Yes. Yes. The rebels in Star Wars, they are rebels because they got guns and they're shooting stormtroopers, and they plan to keep on doing it. So that makes them rebels, not rioters.
Don't sue me, John Williams. Okay, go ahead.
No, it wasn't good enough to be to be copyright infringement there. Don't flatter yourself, Joel. But yeah, so, and it's kind of the same idea. I mean, rebels, they probably want to overthrow the government, but they might not necessarily want to do that. Rebels are just people who, they want some change, and they want it badly enough that they're willing to kill and perhaps die for that, to get that change that they want. And of course, the final stage of this after rebellion is actual revolution. And rebellions can grow into revolutions, as in Star Wars. The rebellion eventually did overthrow the empire. That's actually a good example there, because
you're welcome.
Yes, because in that revolution, the government is overthrown and destroyed, and a new government rises to take its place. That's kind of like the final stage of this. These public expressions of discontent. The ultimate expression is you go and take the government out and you make yourself a new one.
Okay. So let's fit some examples into this just to kind of define our lines a little bit more. Okay. So you got the classic revolutions, right? You have the American Revolution, the French Revolution, that clearly took things all the way, but they also had a very different feel about them in terms of the way things were done. And when you look at the way that the American Revolution played out, clearly there was vandalism, there was violence, there were riots. I mean, there were all the classic indications of a rebellion and a revolution. But you also had a very deliberate nature, and a lot of historians have actually mentioned the fact that it's really interesting to see that the American Revolution was unique in a lot of ways, but one of the primary ways was that it was actually the middle class and the well-off who were doing the rebelling, as compared to most revolutions worldwide that started out with the bottom social tiers in society, the poorest of the poor, and the people who were the most hurt by that particular government's policy stepping forward. The American Revolution, on the other hand, was mostly led by wealthier, well-educated people. And so I think you saw in some ways a very different result, in part because of that, and also obviously in part because of a different set of philosophical principles that united them. The French Revolution, well, the first one, the big one, we'll call it.
The famous one.
The famous one.
The one that you say in capital letters.
Yes, indeed. Very different set of principles, very different outcomes. But what's interesting about it is it didn't start out all that different. It started out with, the king, King Louis, having his own view of the way that things should go in the country, and Parliament really opposing him and actually trying to force their way into drafting a new constitution, which was not that far from what the American colonists were doing as well. But then things went horribly, horribly wrong because that kind of upper tier didn't end up actually leading the revolution that they intended to lead. They ended up getting trampled by it and eventually killed off by it. And the storming of the Bastille had very little to do with the tennis court meeting that was supposed to draft a new constitution. The two of them were not working synchronously as some would have liked, I suppose. And so those two had very, very different outcomes. Now, when you move on from those examples to some other ones, you have other ones that maybe did go all the way to war, but I'd have to ask you where they actually fit into that. So, for instance, the Civil War. There's some debate historically about the Civil War. Was it actually a revolution? Because you had a secession, and then you had this, secession documents would serve as a Declaration of Independence. They were not fighting for, the South was not fighting for control of the United States government. They were fighting to break away and form their own. And so was it really a civil war? Was it really a civil war? Was it a revolution? What was that?
Well, that obviously is a topic for its own podcast or a series of them. I can see that being an excellent podcast. Let's do sometimes Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. That would definitely be a 5-hour episode on that question right there. So maybe, not sure we can tackle it here. But it's interesting to note that in both the American Revolution and the Civil War, you had people who were basically already in charge. The people who were leading the American Revolution were already people who had power and influence in America at the time. who were already to a large extent the leaders in America. And they were really just kind of sawing off or separating themselves from the influence of England, which is quite different from revolutions in, for instance, the French Revolution, or say the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, or many other revolutions in which really are more like civil war scenarios, where you have a new upstart government which is destroying the current government and taking over its territory. And that didn't happen in the American Revolution. The American Revolution, America already had the territory; we just reclaimed it.
Well, yes, and not only that, but one of the central rallying cries was self-governance, right? Like the American colonies were self-governed, and they believed that they were and of right should be an American nation because they were already acting as one. It was just a formal recognition of something that they believed was already happening. So let's move on from something a little bit to something a little bit less violent. Where would you categorize, say, the civil rights movement in that list? Were they just protests? I mean, clearly there was some violence associated with it. Clearly, there was some civil disobedience associated with it. So, where would you put the civil rights movement on that list?
Oh, obviously there was I mean, you talk about the civil rights movement, talking about decades worth of history there and many different people. But civil rights movement, I think, is most characterized by civil disobedience. That was the most effective tactics that we see in the ones that are most famous. For instance, you had the lunch counter sit-ins and the freedom riders, which were people practicing civil disobedience. You had these laws which said that, blacks and whites are not allowed to sit together. Basically, you can't be friends. No being friends with people who aren't the right color, same color as you. It's just, I don't know. That's just
so absurd in the scope of history. But
it sounds so stupid to say that it's one of those things where you say that was the law, that black people and white people couldn't sit together. And that just sounds so stupid that you can't believe that was really true, in living memory. But anyway, so civil disobedience. You have black people and white people defying the laws in the South and sitting by each other and just being friends, which was, I guess, illegal. And sometimes being arrested, sometimes being beaten for that. And that was so very effective because it proved the absurdity. It's like you have this black person and this white person who are just friends, who are just neighbors, and they're being friendly and they're being neighborly, and you have a frenzied mob who is attacking them for it. And you get a photograph of that, and that just proves the absurdity to the nation, and which is, again, that's the point of civil disobedience, is you break the law to prove that the law is wrong. And that's where the civil rights movement had its great success.
No, I think I'd agree with that. And another interesting, defining characteristic of a lot of these successful movements in the past, protests and movements in the past, has been that they have been, they've been oriented towards negative rights rather than positive rights. And to people who might not be familiar with those terms, negative rights are the rights that you're born with, right? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. These are things that you are born with. And unless government or some other person takes them away from you, then you will retain them throughout your life. Positive rights are things you are not born with, but are granted to you by others. And so there's this ongoing conversation about what really constitutes a natural right. Is it a negative right, the right to be able to have and keep your own property, yes, which is what you already have, unless someone takes your property, then clearly you have a right to keep your property, which you were born with. Or is it, as some the Bernie Sanders types of the world would say, you have a positive right, you have a right to health care, you have a right to free education, you have a right to other things that are positive rights. And I think you see a lot of the more successful revolutions in history have been oriented toward negative rights. The ones that have been oriented toward positive rights seem to have not ended well. But let's move on to some more modern examples of protesting and these other levels that you're talking about. So we've got the most recent, well, I don't know if it's the most recent now, but there's been so many of these marches under the resist banner against Trump. But the Women's March was a huge affair. And obviously during that, again, you had some of the more extreme elements show up, which sort of always happens, right? If you have something that you want to be a peaceful protest, there's always some fringe element that's going to show up and start hitting people and burning stuff. Like, it's just sort of what happens. There's these radical elements that just attach themselves to anything that they perceive as popular and try to wreck it. But where would you tend to put things like that? Or maybe the flip side of that on the right would be like the March for Life that every year draws tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people to DC.
Oh, those are protests, of course. I mean, they're protests because it's people speaking. There's no taking the space hostage. There's no threat of violence. There's no do this or else. It's simply people expressing themselves.
So I got to ask you this then, just to push back a little bit, devil's advocate. So there is, if you're talking about blocking the space, there's this notion that we have now of, quote, free speech zones. And I was at a pro-life protest up in Ames not too long ago, and I was on a college campus where they were hosting a forum, and we showed up there to hold signs and talk to people, and we were told they called security on us, and they made us leave to a preordained free speech zone because we were not allowed to be there on public property unless it was in a designated area. So when you're talking about, so that's where I feel like there's some overlap between the protest and the civil disobedience, right? Because our intent was not to break any law, but the law was made in such a way that it forced us into a corner.
Well, basically, in that case, the law says you can't protest. So then if you do protest, at that point, you're doing civil disobedience because you're breaking the law to prove it's wrong.
Well, as long as we could balance on a matchbox, we could protest, you know. So, okay, so that's one example. Now, if you look at maybe the next step up in that from recent American history, you've got the Bureau of Land Management versus the Bundy Boys out in Nevada, I believe. This happened a couple years ago. For those that weren't familiar with it, the Bureau of Land Management, arm of the federal government, had a controversy with a rancher. I can't remember the dad's name, but the ranching family named the Bundys, over grazing rights. So these people had been grazing their cattle on this land for ages, and they were supposed to, I guess, pay a fee to the government for that, or remove their cattle from certain areas. They refused to do so, just based on the fact that they had been doing it forever, and then they had a dispute with the government over it. Well, it escalated very, very quickly from the point where, well, we're angry about your cows being on the wrong land, to we're sending out a SWAT team to pick you up. And the Bundys put out a call to different militia groups, and the militia groups showed up en masse. And there were very highly publicized photos at the time of, opposing armed groups of men. There were armed militia members on horseback lined up against government SWAT teams with assault rifles. And it was a very, very tense few moments on that side of the U.S. And eventually the federal government actually backed down. And it was, claimed as this huge victory, but it was pointed out by some that this was not in any way a legal reaction to, an imposition of the government. So where would you put that in our scope of what we're discussing?
Oh, that was obviously rebellion. I mean, they came with guns and the intention to use lethal force if necessary, and told the government, you're not getting what you want. We're going to defy you. So that was obviously rebellion, which kind of goes to my point earlier that rebellion does not necessarily seek to overthrow the government. It just seeks some concession. So in the case of the Bundys, we had a rebellion that was successful and ultimately was nonviolent.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And then, all right, so then we get to the one that our side, of course, that's more on the conservative, political right spectrum. Now, if you look at the other side, what they would call protests, and I continually hear called protests, was what I would call riots that occurred in Ferguson and Baltimore over, what was deemed to be wrongful police killings. And Black Lives Matter was involved in some of those things, but just in general, I mean, the city's burned, and the destruction there was on a pretty large scale. So I guess I would look at those as being riots. Do you disagree?
Oh no, definitely.
But then that's where a lot of people will draw equivalencies there, and so maybe that's the question that's before us. Like, if we've placed all these where they need to be, the question is when is that appropriate? And I think the reason that it's relevant to us now, aside from what's going on in France, is we've got questions like this here in the U.S. where we've seen not too long ago, actually, it was during the Kavanaugh controversy. Actually, we had people cornering Ted Cruz in a restaurant and harassing him and his wife. We had people, finding conservative talk show hosts and corralling them, surrounding them and threatening them after, eating in a restaurant. They come out the door and they're greeted with a bullhorn and 50 people, shoving into them and invading their space. And protesters show up to Tucker Carlson's home. And I'm not a huge fan of Tucker Carlson, but they really intimidated the heck out of his family and showed up at his house and started screaming outside and chanting. I mean, are these valid avenues of protest? I mean, is anything off limits?
Well, no, I mean, those aren't valid avenues of protest because, again, a protest is a form of speech. You are expressing what you are discontent about. When people surround Tucker Carlson's house and essentially threaten his family, it's like you're not expressing an opinion there. You're basically it's a hostage taking type of behavior where you're saying, "Hey, we're going to occupy this space, which should belong to you, Tucker Carlson. It's his property, but we're going to occupy it and control it unless you do what we want." And that's not a protest at all. It's certainly not civil disobedience. That definitely goes into the rioting zone.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a dangerous, it's a bit of a slippery slope,
Yeah.
right? Because and I thought this, especially in watching the Ted Cruz footage in particular, but also I think with Jeff Flake and in the elevator and some of those other things. I gotta say, some of these senators are much better people than I am. Because if I'm in a restaurant eating dinner with my wife and you show up in there, start screaming and box us in and block my wife's way, I can't guarantee nothing bad going to happen to you. I mean, I can't guarantee that I'm not going to get physical at that point. I just, I believe absolutely in nonviolence, but I also believe that there is an unspoken code of honor that needs to be maintained among people in a decent society. And once lines are crossed in that, then there needs to be defensive force used. So, I mean, in that case, and I'm not talking about, I would try to break somebody's arm or anything like that. But I'm just saying, like, I think there's threatening situations, and as somebody who has is a gun owner and has taken defensive carry courses, you can't put yourself in compromised and impossible situations when you're in a defensive position like that. And so I look at this and I think this is really, like, right now it might just be people screaming at people, but it's a very short step to go from there to something completely different. And I really worry about when that time comes, when you've got politicians actually calling for this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which we, of course, do have. We have that famous quote from Maxine Waters telling her to surround Republicans at gas stations and not let them have any peace and show them they're not welcome and all that. But
Right.
you're kind of touching on something there, which is the further we go up this scale, the harder things get to control.
Mhm.
Once you introduce violence into a situation, it becomes much harder to predict what's going to happen. If you have two people talking to each other as in a protest, I mean, people talk and hopefully they listen and then they go home at the end. It's very easy to predict what's going to happen there. Again, civil disobedience, which is inherently a nonviolent form of protest. You break the law to prove it's wrong, and you take the consequence. Again, predictable results. You're maybe going to get arrested. If possibly you might get beat up. You're not going to fight back, and so probably ends there. It's fairly predictable what'll happen. Once you get into the rioting behaviors, you really don't know what's going to happen. If like those people who surrounded Tucker Carlson's house and were shouting threats at his family, how seriously do you take a threat? If I take this threat seriously, that you're shouting at me that you're going to get me or that I'm not safe in my home or whatever, and I interpret that as that you intend to attack me, am I justified in attacking you back? Am I justified in shooting first in that case?
Depends on the state legally.
Right. Well, legally, yeah. But the thing is, you have to ask that question. And if you do those sort of rioting behaviors where you're threatening people, where you are encroaching upon, private spaces, where you're destroying property, you're creating a situation in which people have to ask those questions. People have to ask themselves the questions, do I shoot first? And that's not good. You
Right.
don't want to make people ask themselves that.
Right. It's a bad place to be. And I think part of what muddies the water further is that people are find it so difficult, as we've talked about on this program before, Josh Hugo, about the tribalism. We tend to see our own causes as righteous and just 100% of the time, and the other side's causes as terrible and awful 100% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there was this, you watch these different things develop. You had, when the Bundy Boys were going at it with the BLM, our side was just, cheering and like hollering.
You said BLM, is that what you meant?
Yes, Bureau of Land Management. Yes.
Oh, not Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, there's
so many acronyms. All right,
there are two of them.
Bureau of Land Management. Please continue.
Bureau of Land Management. Yes. So, but when that was happening, you had conservative pundits and conservative media, and myself, who believed that the federal government was far overreaching there, celebrating this win, but it was an armed standoff. That's what it was. Let's be clear about it. This was not people carrying signs. This was an armed standoff with the threat of violent force and potentially lethal force if the government overstepped its bounds in this case, enforced by private citizens. Okay, and yet when we look at the other side of this, when we flip the script and we see the violence that went on in these different cities in response to police shootings, which you can argue the merits of whether those were justified or not, and that's not, that's a topic for a different day. But if you look at it from the perspective of people who believe that they were not justified, then clearly that's a similar situation. From their point of view, that's a similar situation. From their point of view, if you're a fair-minded person, you look at this and you say, we watched a bunch of dudes out in Nevada stand down the federal government with guns, and the federal government tucked tail and ran home. But here in our own communities, in the urban areas, our boys, stand up to the government, we get shot. And now, again, I don't want to argue the merits of it, because I have all sorts of issues with the narratives surrounding, police killings, and I also have a lot of problems with a lot of the excessive enforcement themselves. I think that it is a legitimate issue, that there's police overreach all over the place. But be that as it may, when does it become necessary? When does it become justifiable? Because the people who are saying things like Maxine Waters, they are framing this, whether honestly or dishonestly, I don't know. I don't know which one would actually be more troubling, but they're framing this in such a way that it's your duty to go resist these people and go find them and go chase them down, because what they're doing is equivalent to the greatest atrocities in history. And that's where it gets really, really dicey, because if especially in this age of instant communication, if you can convince people that the other guy is doing something horribly, horribly evil, then it's sort of a natural, isn't it sort of a natural progression to say, well, yes, of course, if Adolf Hitler was in my town, I should go knock on his door and tell him I'm angry, right? Like that's what people jump to. And so it's a reasonable reaction. The question is whether it's right.
Well, you asked the question, like, what distinguishes, like, the Bundy standoff from, like, the Ferguson riots? And I think we can have an answer to that question that doesn't really judge the motives or the character of either party. We can have, I think, a pragmatic answer. And the pragmatic answer there is that the Bundy standoff was effective because it was highly specific. The boys, the men, the people, the human beings on the Bundy side, they had very specific demands. Basically, let the Bundys alone, let their cattle graze. And because the demands were very specific, they were able to get a response out of that, and their rebellion was effective. As opposed to, for instance, like the riots in Ferguson, the goals are really vague. I mean, some people there produced, manifestos that were sort of, in my opinion, sort of rambling, sort of vague. But it's like, what does it take? The Yellow Vest protests in Paris, they have a bit of vagueness about them, but the main thing that they wanted was to have these fuel taxes repealed. And I guess they've gotten that now, so we'll see how, if the protests do die down now. But it was specific. There was a specific thing they wanted, whereas with these other protests that we're talking about, or riots that we're talking about in American cities, they're often not specific at all, and it's not necessarily clear what they want or what actions on the part of the government would satisfy their demands.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to push back to you with a meme. Okay, because one of the memes that was floating around when people were rioting in these cities and causing destruction was basically equating it to the Boston Tea Party. And I struggled with this a little bit, because my knee-jerk reaction, of course, was to dismiss it as stupidity and just sort of like, oh, okay, sure, there's no comparison there. But when I thought about it more, that, the Boston Tea Party was not them going after the King of England. It was them, the American colonists, wearing disguises, breaking onto a private cargo ship and dumping a bunch of taxed tea out into the harbor, which was really not an act of defiance or revolution in any way as far as the government went. It was a vague demonstration of anger against a government act that was taken out on a private citizen. I mean, somebody actually lost a bunch of tea. It was an act of vandalism is what it was. Mm-hmm. So, what is, if you have a general angst and a general fury against a government policy that is related to a certain item of protest, does that then justify protest against that?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, again, that's complicated questions. Does it justify it? I don't know. I'm not sure where the line. When is violence ever justified? I think that's a question that's difficult to apply a specific formula to. However, I think we can say that violence can only be justified if the violence is effective. Pointless violence that is just destruction for its own sake, is always wrong. There can never be justification for pointless violence. And so I think if you're going to go that route, if you're going to have a riot, going to have a rebellion or whatever, you really need to have a very specific agenda. And so the Boston Tea Party, although of course you're correct, it was just really, this thing we celebrate history was really just, petty vandalism. I mean, we come down to it.
It kind of was. I mean, it was really cool, petty vandalism from our perspective. But again, it really was just vandalism.
Yeah, but it was vandalism that sent a very specific message. And I think that's the difference. So, I mean, from a moral perspective, was the Boston Tea Party justified? I'm not prepared to answer that question the time we have left.
Right.
But I can say that it was effective vandalism because everyone who witnessed the vandalism knew exactly the message that was supposed to be communicated, and the message was communicated.
Right. So we try to tie everything together here on constructive interference, and in terms of life principles, really does the question of protest and degrees of protest, does it really come down to how much we believe in something? And the question that we were trying to grapple with coming into this program is, if we look at the March for Life, for instance, and you look at the premise of the pro-life cause, which is that unborn babies are human beings and that they deserve the right to life, and that hundreds of thousands of them are being murdered by abortion every year, wouldn't that be an actual reason to protest in very, very in very involved manners? I mean, if that doesn't cause you to protest, I mean, we all look at Nazi Germany and say, well, people should have protested the death camps, right? What were the German citizens doing? And history will forever, they'll forever bear their shame as a nation because the citizens did nothing. And so that's where, when you look at this, and again, if you want to flip the script and you look at it from the left's position, they say that Donald Trump is tear gassing babies at the southern border. So if that's how you see it, what would you not do in protest? I mean, if that's the way you see it, and you see pictures of babies running from tear gas canisters, and that's your conviction on it, wouldn't a lot of protest be justified there? So really, how much of it comes down to how much you believe in something, how strongly you believe in it? And that raises the question of how many of us are hypocrites for not protesting things that we claim to believe very strongly in principle. And then the second question that's very, very relevant to all things political is this: do the ends justify the means? Clearly, that's not something that we're going to resolve on this podcast, but it is a pivotal question that affects all things political all the time. And I guess the final thought that I would give on it is, the ability to protest. And there was a quote by Macron in France, who, you can take this to say maybe that it was a little bit of a Marie Antoinette moment, right? His quote was, democracy, quote, democracy is not in the street. He's come out and criticized these rioters, and that was one of his quotes, was democracy is not in the street. But I would say that, at least in the American system, the ability to protest and the ability to have effective protest was actually enshrined, and it was deliberately maintained by the colonists when they put this new government together, by the early American founders when they put this government together. And I think it's borne out in the statement of Samuel Adams, which is one of my favorite quotes, that reads, "It does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority, keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men." That's the promise of America, and that's where I think we need to look to as we look for effective and meaningful protests against things that we disagree with in principle. But what do you think? We'll be joining the discussion with you this week on social media. Make sure, again, that you head out to Facebook and follow us at facebook.com/TheCI Show and on Twitter @TheCI Show. We will talk to you next week. Thanks for joining us on Constructive Interference.